Hi, it's Loren Lockman from the Tanglewood Wellness Center, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about acid and alkaline foods and how do we know what to eat and when to eat it. You know, the first piece is, let me clarify. The conversation's a little confusing because we talk about acid and alkaline with two very different contexts, and it's important to understand they're two different things. So some people confuse them and think that if being acidic, having an acid system is a bad thing, then we should probably avoid acid foods like citrus and pineapples and tomatoes. What you want to understand, first of all, is that those foods are acidic on the table. That is, they have a high citric acid content. But they're not acid-forming foods. The problem is when we consume foods that tend to move the body's pH towards a higher level of acidity, which is a lower pH. So we tend to drop the body's pH, the blood's pH. That's caused by acid-forming foods, and that's a problem. That's a problem. That's the problem that actually causes osteoporosis, okay, and probably a lot of other conditions. Okay, osteoporosis is a situation where your body is giving up calcium and other minerals, losing bone density, not as an accident. It's actually an intelligent choice, because your body realizes that either it finds a way to deal with the excess acidity in the bloodstream or it dies. Okay? And so it chooses to give up bone density, it chooses to give up calcium and other minerals to alkalinize your bloodstream, to raise your pH. Your body's doing this on purpose. Now, the thing is, it's like, well, that seems like a crummy choice. Actually, if you compare it to the opposite choice, the other choice, which is death, I think osteoporosis is a great choice. Much rather have osteoporosis than death. However, what would be really smart would be to stop creating the conditions that created osteoporosis. So what we can do is we can simply avoid acid-forming foods. And really, when we're talking about acid-forming foods, there's really no quantity of acid-forming foods that we ever need to consume. We don't need them. They're completely unnecessary. Well, won't we become too alkaline if we don't eat acid-forming foods? No, we won't. Now, it is possible to become overly alkaline. Okay? You've heard of acidosis. Well, there's something called alkalosis. And alkalosis is where your pH becomes too high. The irony is it's not caused by consuming alkaline-forming foods. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? It's caused by consuming acid-forming foods. It's very similar to what happens with hypoglycemia most of the time. Let's look at hypoglycemia for a second. Most hypoglycemia is the body reacting to hyperglycemic foods, to foods with a high glycemic load. So when someone's eating a lot of foods that have a high glycemic load, and those can be candy bars or Twinkies or table sugar, or they could be white bread, okay, or rice, because these starches are converted into sugar. They're broken down into simple sugars, and they hit the body, the bloodstream at one time because there's no fiber present to slow down the sugar's absorption, and all of a sudden there's this wall of sugar hitting the bloodstream, and boom, blood sugar spikes. And what does an intelligent body do? It says, oh, you know what, this blood sugar spike could kill me, so I'm going to flood the bloodstream with insulin. It's not a measured response. It's not like the body has the chance to say, well, let's see just exactly how much sugar there is, and then we'll put in just the right amount of insulin. It's an emergency response where the body says, I'm going to flood the bloodstream with insulin because this could be a serious problem. What happens is blood sugar crashes. But it didn't crash because we weren't consuming enough sugar. It crashed because we were consuming high glycemic load foods primarily, and we forced it up so high that the body had to respond in this emergency context. Well, the same thing happens with alkalinity and acidity. If we're consuming exclusively acid-forming foods, then the body is going to respond as if it's an emergency, because it is. And what happens is the response can be too strong. Because it's an emergency response rather than a carefully measured response. the alkalinity can be pushed too high. And alkalosis is caused not from alkaline-forming foods, but from an excess of acid-forming foods. So how many acid-forming foods do we need? None. Okay? What foods are acid-forming? What foods are alkaline-forming? Well, acid-forming foods include processed sugar, pretty much all grains, nuts and seeds, all animal products, okay, meat, dairy, eggs, beans. So what does that leave? What's not acid forming?
Green.
Fruit and the other vegetables, leafy green vegetables. Okay? Those are the things that are not acid forming, and those are the only things, in my opinion, that actually belong in the human body on a regular and consistent basis. Now, nuts and seeds, many people include in their diet. I do not include nuts and seeds in my regular diet. I have no nuts and seeds in my kitchen. Right now I have watermelon and papaya and mangoes and tangerines and tomatoes and avocados and some greens and maybe a few other fruits. But I have no nuts and seeds. Okay? I don't keep nuts and seeds here. I don't ever buy them unless I'm doing some very unusual things, a special gourmet kind of meal, not for me, but preparing for other people. Okay? Otherwise, I don't believe in using them. Having said that, I think they may have served an important role for us evolutionarily when there were times where there was no other food available, and nuts in their shell would have been good for a long time. We could have lived on them when there was nothing else. But when we have options like fresh fruits and vegetables, why would you want to eat these very concentrated sources of fat and protein, which are very difficult to digest, take a lot of the body's energy, and are acid forming? Okay, we don't need to do that. So stick to alkaline forming foods. You will never become too alkaline as a result of doing that. You'll get everything you need. And don't worry about the foods that are acidic on the table, because citrus is perfectly fine for most people. There are people that are allergic to citrus and they need to cleanse their body. There are people who have candida problems, and they should usually avoid citrus as well because of an invisible food mold that lives in the skin, the little crevices in the citrus fruit as it does in cantaloupes. Those things are very hard to handle in any way or cut without creating a problem if you're sensitive to mold, as people with yeast infections are. So aside from those groups of people, citrus fruits are perfectly good. Pineapples are perfectly good foods if they're properly ripened. Tomatoes. All acid fruits are fine, and all acid fruits are alkaline forming in the body. Okay? So I hope that clears it up. Any questions about that? Did that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Terrific.
What does it mean to be an acid food or an alkaline food?
Well, pH is actually the potential of hydrogen, the potential to bond with hydrogen. And so everything has a pH, and therefore can be talked about in terms of acidity. So if you look at water, pure water with no minerals has a pH of 7. It's neutral. Okay? Some people think that means it's not acid. Well, you can think of it that way, but again, really, it's always about hydrogen potential. So it has a hydrogen potential of 7. We consider anything below that to be acid. And the pH scale is logarithmic. So every time you go from 1 to the next lower whole number, it's 10 times the effect. Okay, so pH of 6 is 10 times stronger than a pH of 7. And a pH of 5 is 100 times stronger than a pH of 7. So you could say that something with a pH of 5 is 100 times more acidic than water.
But what is going on in this acid food that makes it acidic?
It's just the presence, it's the makeup of the food. It's the chemical makeup of the food. That's all. It's,
but when we ingest it in the body, it changes
well, again,
the pH.
this is where we need to talk about whether it's an acid food like a citrus or a pineapple, or it's an acid-forming food. So acid-forming foods, these are foods that have an acid or an alkaline ash. And that ash is determined by the mineral content of the food. So foods that contain certain minerals like sulfur are going to be acid forming, and foods that contain other minerals like more calcium are going to be more alkaline forming. Okay? But that's what determines whether something is acid or alkaline forming. Again, it's the makeup of the food, and it's specifically the mineral content of the food which leaves an ash. After the, if we think about putting a log in the fireplace, after it's burned, there's an ash left over. If you think about putting an organic substance into the body, when the body is done consuming it, there's something left over. That substance, whether it's, depending on the mineral content of that substance, what's left over, that determines whether it's acid or alkaline forming. The good news is that as long as we stick to our natural diet, we never have to worry about this. It's a non-issue. If you're living on fruits and leafy greens, you don't ever have to even think about this.
Well, I understand that, but I'm just thinking about having conversations with people who don't know anything. And I'm just babbling on about acid and alkaline, but I don't know what I'm talking about, really.
Right. Well, yeah. How do you present this in a way that makes sense to the average person? I would simply point out, I don't think you actually need to explain too much other than to say that certain foods are acid forming, and they tend to push your blood's pH down, which is lethal, potentially lethal, and your body reacts in a way to protect itself. It's a harmful situation, and that almost everything people eat is acid forming, because the only things that are alkaline forming are fruit and leafy greens and a few other vegetables. But almost everything else is acid forming. Hope that helps.